The air in the forbidden archives did not just sit, it pressed. It tasted of pulverized parchment, dry rot, and the metallic tang of magic left to stagnate for centuries. Alistair pushed the heavy oak door, the hinges screaming a protest that died instantly in the suffocating gloom. Slivers of moonlight cut through the grimy, leaded glass above, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the air like frozen sparks. He held a small charm aloft, its light flickering, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the labyrinthine shelves. Every step he took on the cold stone floor sent a hollow echo vibrating through the room, a sound that felt entirely too loud in the absolute stillness. He moved deeper, his boots crunching against grit and fallen debris. The shelves stretched upward, disappearing into a ceiling lost to darkness. He stopped, tilting his head. The atmosphere here was thick, heavy with an intent that felt almost predatory. Alistair adjusted his grip on the charm, his knuckles white, and pressed forward into the heart of the silence. The silence broke. It did not end with a sound, but with a sensation, a sudden, icy prickle against his skin. Arcane wards, dormant for centuries, flared to life as he crossed an invisible threshold. Thin, translucent ribbons of energy uncoiled from the stone floor, wrapping around his ankles like tethering vines. He stumbled, his boot catching on a loose flagstone, but he kicked out, shattering the spectral grip with a sharp, violent motion. Whispers followed. They were not words, but a low, rhythmic vibration that crawled up his spine, echoing the frantic thrum of his own pulse. He ignored them. He kept his gaze fixed on the towering shelves ahead, his jaw set. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching for his heels, but he did not slow his pace. He walked with purpose, dragging the weight of the library's resistance behind him. Every step was a deliberate challenge to the unseen guardians. He reached out, his fingers grazing the rough, cold spines of the books, and the air around him hissed in protest. He was an intruder who refused to be evicted. Alistair stopped, his chest heaving. The cold from the ward still clung to his skin, but a different heat began to rise from within. He leaned against a shelf, his hand trembling as he traced the grain of the wood. Vivian's voice echoed in the stillness, sharp and urgent. She had stood in the courtyard yesterday, her eyes fixed on his, warning him about the bloodlines. She spoke of dormant power, of rituals that demanded a price, and of the danger inherent in their very names. He had dismissed her with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of practiced indifference. Now, the memory thrummed beneath his skin, a rhythmic, pulsing ache that matched the vibration of the library itself. His own magic, volatile and restless, flared in response to her words. It felt like liquid fire moving through his veins, a chaotic current that refused to be contained. He clenched his fist, feeling the raw energy spark against his palm. He was a Finchwood. Curiosity was not just a choice, it was his inheritance, woven into the marrow of his bones. He ignored the lingering chill of the warning, forcing the heat of his magic to settle. The risk was real, but the pull of the forbidden was stronger. He moved deeper into the stacks, his boots striking the stone with a steady, hollow rhythm. The air grew heavier here, saturated with the dry, biting scent of pulverized parchment and ancient, trapped dust. He tracked his progress by the shifting geometry of the shelves, which seemed to lean inward as if guarding their contents. Every few paces, he ran his hand along the spines, feeling the varying textures of leather, hide, and cracked wood. He hit a dead end, a wall of shelves packed so tightly they appeared fused together. He pressed his shoulder against the wood, heaving, until the entire unit groaned and shifted an inch, revealing a narrow gap behind it. He squeezed through, the rough edges of the shelves scraping his sides. On the other side, the atmosphere changed. The oppressive pressure of the outer library thinned, replaced by a focused, humming stillness. Finally, he stopped. His light caught a weathered plaque bolted to the stone. Architectural Arcana. He exhaled, the sound sharp in the quiet. The tomes were immense, their leather covers stiff and cold against his palms. He pulled them down one by one, the sound of their weight hitting the stone floor echoing through the narrow aisle. Pages turned with a dry, brittle rasp, revealing diagrams that looked less like illustrations and more like anatomical maps of veins and arteries. He pushed aside a stack of crumbling records and saw it. Tucked into the corner of the shelf sat a thick, leather-bound journal. He reached for it, his fingers catching on the cover. It was embossed with a symbol that stood out against the worn surface, a black rose, its thorns twisting around a silver serpent. As his grip tightened on the binding, the floor beneath his boots gave a sudden, sharp shudder. It was not a tremor of the earth, but a low, guttural hum that vibrated up through his soles. The sound was deep, resonant, and unmistakably alive. He stood perfectly still, the journal held firmly in his hands. The vibration grew more insistent, pulsing in time with the quickening beat of his own heart. The library was no longer just a collection of stone and paper. It was reacting to the book he had just claimed. The Blackthorn had been found. He set the journal on a nearby pedestal and flipped the cover. The pages were yellowed, stiff with age, and covered in dense, jagged script. He squinted, his charm casting a harsh light that made the ink appear to writhe. Elder runes. He had heard the masters speak of them in hushed tones, claiming they were impossible to translate without years of rigorous study. He traced the first line with his index finger, expecting the usual frustration of academic jargon. Instead, the characters seemed to pull at his focus. He blinked, shaking his head, but the symbols remained sharp, demanding to be understood. He leaned in, his breath hitching, as the meaning bypassed his conscious thought and settled directly into his mind. It was not a language he had learned. It was a language he recognized. He read a paragraph, then a page, his eyes darting across the parchment with increasing speed. The disdain he usually held for such scholarly pursuits vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He was not reading, he was remembering. He was a Finchwood, and the forbidden knowledge was an inheritance. Alistair turned the page, and the diagrams shifted. They were no longer static ink. They were blueprints of a circulatory system. He traced the lines, realizing the academy was not built of stone and mortar, but of conduits and nodes that functioned like nerves and arteries. The text described the entire structure as a living magical entity, a gargantuan organism that breathed through the very air he was currently displacing. He pressed his hand against the cold stone of the pedestal, and the surface felt warm, almost soft, beneath his palm. The hum he had felt earlier increased in intensity, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the cadence of his own breathing. He looked up, scanning the vaulted ceiling. The shadows in the corners seemed to contract and expand in a slow, deliberate cycle. This was not a library. It was a cage, or perhaps a heart. Every archway and corridor was a vein, channeling raw, untamed energy through the foundation of the manor. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure against his eardrums. The ink on the page pulsed, a dark, viscous liquid that mapped out a path deep beneath the floorboards. He was standing inside a predator, and it had finally noticed him. He turned the page again, his fingers trembling against the brittle parchment. The diagrams grew more intricate, branching out like a family tree mapped in veins of ink. The text explicitly named the conduits. They were not merely architectural, they were ancestral. Each node was anchored to a specific bloodline, a biological key required to unlock the dormant power beneath the stone. He scanned the list, his eyes snagging on a familiar, jagged script. Finchwood. A surge of arrogance flared in his chest. He was not just an observer here, he was a component of the machine. He pressed his thumb against the diagram, and the ink flared with a sickly, pale light. The connection was instantaneous. He felt the Academy's pulse synchronize with his own heartbeat, a rhythmic thudding that echoed in his marrow. Alistair flipped to the final page of the journal. A yellowed map occupied the entire spread, its surface etched with intricate, glowing lines that seemed to shift under his gaze. He leaned closer, the scent of ozone rising from the parchment. As he focused, the lines detached from the paper, hovering in the air between his hands. It was a three-dimensional projection of the Academy, a web of pulsing light that mapped the manor's foundations in terrifying detail. He watched as the conduits branched out like roots, weaving through the stone and deep into the earth. The complexity was staggering. Thousands of nodes flickered in a chaotic, rhythmic sequence, each representing a valve of raw, trapped energy. His eyes darted across the projection, struggling to track the flow of power as it surged through the invisible architecture. The light from the map grew brighter, casting long, distorted shadows against the library walls. He felt a sharp stabbing pressure behind his eyes as his mind attempted to map the sheer scale of the network. It was not just a floor plan, it was a nervous system, vast and hungry. He reached out to touch a shimmering artery, but his fingers passed through the light, leaving a trail of sparks in the stagnant air. The sheer volume of information threatened to overwhelm him. Alistair ignored the swirling light of the map and focused his vision on the very center of the projection. There, nestled beneath the deepest foundation, a single point pulsed with a light that defied the surrounding geometry. It was darker than the rest, a void that seemed to pull the surrounding energy toward it. He traced the label etched in archaic runes, the Blackthorn. The name hit him like a physical blow. The air in the archive suddenly felt thin, stripped of its oxygen. He leaned into the projection, his eyes locked on the rhythmic contraction of the node. It was not static, it was beating. A cold shiver crawled up his spine, settling at the base of his skull. He pressed his palm against the cold stone floor, and the vibration traveled up his arm, a steady, guttural thrum that matched the pulse of the node. This was no mere architectural curiosity. It was a heart. A living, breathing engine of shadow and blood buried beneath the weight of the Academy. The realization grounded him, turning his curiosity into a sharp, jagged edge of panic. He was standing directly above it. Alistair pulled his hand away from the floor, but the thrumming did not stop. It had migrated. The vibration was now inside him, humming along his marrow, syncing perfectly with the volatile magic he had spent years trying to suppress. He stood still, watching as the air around his fingertips began to warp and shimmer. The Blackthorn was not merely a source of power, it was a mirror. Every jagged, untamed surge of energy he felt within his own veins was reflected in the rhythmic, violent expansion of the node on the map. He felt a sickening surge of kinship. The Academy was not just a building, it was a cage for something that shared his own chaotic essence. His breath hitched as a spark of violet light jumped from his skin, arcing toward the journal. The pages curled and blackened where the energy touched them, yet the map remained, glowing with an intensity that made his eyes ache. He was not just observing the heart of the manor, he was feeding it. He was a Finchwood, and in this moment the boundary between his own volatile spirit and the ancient, hungry foundation dissolved entirely into a singular, terrifying resonance. The resonance reached a fever pitch, a deafening roar of magic that existed only in the mind. Alistair stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the map, his own energy bleeding into the ancient ink. He was no longer a student in a library. He was a conduit, a bridge between the living stone and the dark heart pulsing miles beneath. The air grew dense, charged with the static of a brewing storm. Then, the impossible happened. A sharp, ragged intake of breath cut through the heavy silence of the archives. It was not his own. The connection snapped like a frayed wire. Alistair gasped, stumbling backward as the violet light around his hands vanished. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm replacing the slow, rhythmic thrum of the Blackthorn. He spun around, his boots skidding. He thrust his charm upward, the small light flaring into a brilliant, blinding orb that cut through the shadows. Someone was standing there. The orb of light pulsed, casting long, erratic shadows that danced against the stone walls. Alistair held his position, his knuckles white as he gripped the charm. The figure in the archway did not flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that betrayed his composure. The light caught the sharp angles of his face, illuminating features carved with aristocratic precision. His hair caught the glow, a metallic sheen that seemed to draw the light toward him. It was Julian Thorne. He stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed yet ready, a stark contrast to the dust-choked decay of the archives. His eyes, a piercing, icy blue, locked onto Alistair with a predatory focus. There was no warmth in that gaze, only a calculated, dangerous assessment. He occupied the space with an effortless authority, his presence turning the cramped aisle into a stage for a confrontation. The air between them grew thin, charged with the weight of their family's history. Julian did not speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, his eyes sweeping over the open journal in Alistair's hand, then back to his face. He was a statue of cold, calculated menace, standing at the threshold. Alistair forced his jaw to relax, pulling his lips into a practiced, cynical smirk. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but he kept his gaze steady, refusing to let the tremor in his hands show. He leaned back against the shelf, creating a deliberate distance between them. "Thorne," he murmured, the name tasting like ash. "Always lurking where you believe you belong. How terribly predictable." Julian did not blink. He remained motionless in the archway, his expression a mask of icy detachment. "Predictable, perhaps, but effective," Julian countered, his voice a low, smooth blade that sliced through the stale air of the archives. He took a slow, measured step forward, his eyes never leaving Alistair's face. "I knew you could not resist the pull of these vaults. My sister warned me you would be drawn here." Alistair felt the mention of Vivian like a physical strike, but he only tightened his grip on the journal. "Your sister seems to have a better grasp of reality than you do," he retorted, his voice dripping with calculated disdain. He let the journal snap shut, the sound echoing sharply against the stone. "Unlike some, I am not content to accept the hollow lies this academy feeds its privileged sons." Julian stepped fully into the dim light, his movements precise and devoid of hesitation. He did not look at the shelves but at Alistair, as if the surrounding history were merely background noise to their collision. He stopped just short of the aisle, his presence effectively blocking the only exit. He gestured toward the open journal still clutched in Alistair's hand, a faint, humorless smile touching his mouth. "You think this is a discovery, Finchwood? You think you stumbled upon a secret?" He took another step, the sound of his boots echoing with finality against the floor. "I have been watching this section for 3 nights. I knew the moment you stepped into the library that you would come here. You are not a seeker of truth. You are a moth drawn to a flame." Alistair felt the weight of the realization. He had been led. The archives were not a sanctuary, but a cage. Julian's gaze intensified. "You are exactly where I intended you to be," Julian continued. "Now, tell me what you think you have found." Alistair stared at the journal, the weight of the leather binding grounding him against the sudden, suffocating pressure of the room. He did not look up at Julian. Instead, he traced the embossed symbol on the cover, feeling the cold, raised edges of the thorns. He let out a sharp, jagged breath, the sound swallowed instantly by the heavy, dust-laden air. With a sudden, violent motion, he snapped the book shut. The sound cracked through the silence like a whip, echoing off the vaulted ceiling and vibrating through the floorboards. He finally met Julian's gaze, his eyes narrowing into slits of defiance. "You speak of depth, Thorne, as if you have ever dared to look beneath the surface," Alistair said, his voice low and vibrating with a controlled, dangerous intensity. He stepped forward, closing the gap Julian had created, ignoring the way the air seemed to thicken between them. "You are so comfortable in your role, so eager to protect the status quo, that you have become blind to the rot beneath your feet." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding shelves, his movements sharp and dismissive. "I am not a moth, and this is not a flame. It is a hollow cage, and you are merely the guard who has forgotten he is also a prisoner. I am done accepting the pretty lies this academy feeds its privileged sons." Julian did not flinch. He merely watched, his expression hardening into a mask of icy, aristocratic contempt. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands clenching at his sides until the knuckles turned white. The silence between them stretched, heavy and jagged. "Uncontrolled," Julian murmured, the word dripping with a lifetime of inherited prejudice. "That is the only word for it, Finchwood. You possess power, yet you treat it like a blunt instrument, swinging it wildly at things you cannot possibly understand." He gestured toward the journal in Alistair's grip, his eyes flashing with a cold, piercing light. "You speak of rot, yet you are the one wallowing in the filth of forbidden lore. It is not just your ignorance that offends me, it is your arrogance. You think your chaotic impulses are a virtue, but they are nothing more than the symptoms of a bloodline that has long since lost its way. He stopped just inches from Alistair, his posture rigid, his jaw set in a line of absolute, historical hatred. You are a danger to this institution, and frankly, a stain upon the very air you breathe. Do you truly believe your little rebellion will change anything? Alistair let out a dark, sharp laugh that echoed against the stone walls, devoid of any humor. He did not retreat. Instead, he leaned back against the shelf, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the leather cover of the journal. Depravity? He repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with deliberate malice. I found quite a lot of it in these pages, Thorne, but it does not stop with the Finchwoods. It implicates the very foundations of this academy, and perhaps it implicates your esteemed family more than you dare to imagine. He watched Julian closely, searching for the slightest crack in that polished, aristocratic veneer. He found it. A subtle tightening appeared around the corners of Julian's eyes, and his jaw locked, a fractional, involuntary clench that betrayed his sudden unease. The bait had been taken. Julian's posture shifted, the rigid, practiced confidence faltering for the first time. Alistair smirked, sensing the shift in momentum, and held the journal out, forcing Julian to confront the evidence of his own family's hidden history. Julian stepped back, his boots striking the stone with a sharp, percussive snap. He raised a hand, palm out, as if to physically ward off the words. Nonsense, he spat, the word thin and brittle. You are grasping at shadows, Finchwood. Trying to shift the blame for your own family's failures onto the architects of this academy is a pathetic tactic. He began to pace, a tight, controlled circle that kept his profile hidden from Alistair. His movements were too precise, too calculated to be genuine. The history of this place is documented, verified, and absolute. It is not some playground for your wild theories. He stopped abruptly, turning to face Alistair, but his gaze did not hold the same icy focus as before. It darted toward the shelves, then back to the journal. It will not work, he insisted, his voice dropping to a strained, urgent register. You think you have found a secret, but you have only found a mirror for your own instability. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the journal, then pulled back as if burned. The mask was slipping, revealing the raw, frantic pulse. Alistair did not blink. He let the silence stretch, watching the frantic energy drain from Julian's posture. History, Thorne, is written by the victors, Alistair said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that cut through the archive's gloom. And these journals tell a story that your textbooks conveniently omit. A story of Blackwood as a living entity, its magic tethered to our bloodlines. It is not just architecture. It is a machine, and it is fueled by something called the Blackthorn. He watched the name land. The effect was immediate. Julian froze, his entire frame locking as if struck by a sudden, invisible force. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating until the blue was nearly swallowed by black. He did not speak, but the sharp intake of breath hissed through his teeth. His hand, resting near his side, spasmed, fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeve. The arrogance that usually defined his presence vanished. Alistair took a slow step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and saw the color drain from Julian's face. Julian did not look away, but the sharp edge of his previous hostility had dulled into something far more jagged. He took a half step toward the table, his movements heavy, as if the air itself had become viscous. You are plagued with currents you cannot possibly hope to navigate, Finchwood, he said. His voice was no longer a weapon. It was a low, urgent vibration. He leaned in, his hands pressed flat against the cold surface of the table, his knuckles white. Some doors are locked for a reason. Some names are buried in the dark because the light would burn them and us to ash. You think you have uncovered a truth, but you have only triggered a mechanism. If you continue to pull at these threads, the entire structure will unravel. He reached out, not to grab the book, but to hover his hand over the map, his fingers trembling. I am telling you to stop. Walk away. He looked at Alistair then, his eyes searching, stripped of all pretense, revealing a genuine, cold-blooded fear. Alistair did not retreat. Instead, he traced the jagged ink lines on the map with a steady finger, his eyes locked on the pulsing nodes. Walk away? You speak as if this is a choice, Thorne. Look at these diagrams. He tapped the page, the sound echoing sharply against the stone walls. These are not mere structural supports, these are veins. The entire academy is a living, breathing entity, and we are standing inside its circulatory system. He watched Julian flinch, the man's jaw tightening until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. Alistair continued, his voice dropping to a smooth, taunting cadence. The conduits are not just architectural quirks. They are channels for raw, sentient power. They pulse with a rhythm that matches the blood in our own bodies. Can you not feel it? The way the stone vibrates beneath your feet? It is hungry, Julian. It feeds on the very essence of our bloodlines. He leaned closer, enjoying the way Julian shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the shadows as if expecting the floor to move. Julian's breath hitched, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his knuckles turning bloodless. The discomfort was palpable, a physical weight. Alistair let his own energy rise, a dark, rhythmic thrumming that began in his marrow and spilled outward. He did not speak, but the air between them thickened, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that set the loose parchment on the table to dancing. The stone beneath them groaned, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the academy. Dust cascaded from the vaulted ceiling, coating the floor in a fine gray veil. Alistair's fingers, still resting on the map, sparked with a faint, violet discharge that arced toward the ink lines. The floorboards beneath Julian's boots buckled, a sharp crack echoing through the archive as the foundation shifted. Julian's head snapped up, his posture breaking as he stumbled, his heels scraping against the stone. He took a wide, involuntary step backward, his hands reaching out to steady himself against a shelf that rattled under the sudden kinetic surge. His eyes were wide, fixed on Alistair. The violent shaking ceased as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of settling debris and their own ragged breathing. Julian remained near the shelf, his fingers still gripping the edge of the wood, but the sharp, defensive tension had bled out of his shoulders. He did not move to attack. Instead, his eyes tracked the faint, violet sparks that still clung to the edges of the open journal. The air remained thick, charged with the ozone scent of spent magic, but the hostility that had defined their interaction for years felt suddenly hollow. Julian tilted his head, his gaze shifting from the map to Alistair, then back to the diagram. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The blue of his eyes, once icy and distant, now burned with a focused, analytical light. He stepped away from the shelf, his movements fluid and unhurried, closing the distance until he stood just outside the reach of Alistair's lingering aura. He looked at the floor where the stone had cracked, then up at the ceiling. Julian reached out, his hand hovering inches from the page, his expression shifting into a mask of profound, unsettling realization. Alistair did not wait for an invitation. He pressed his index finger firmly against the center of the yellowed parchment, right where the ink pulsed with a rhythmic, dark intensity. The map was not a mere drawing. It was a schematic of the Academy's hidden anatomy. He dragged his nail slowly across the surface, tracing the lines that connected the deepest foundations. "Look," he commanded, his voice devoid of its earlier mockery. Julian leaned in, his face inches from the journal. Alistair pointed to the label etched in archaic script at the heart of the layout. It was marked as the Blackthorn, the central node of the entire estate. Beneath the name, 2 words were scrawled in a darker, more viscous ink: blood and shadow. Alistair felt the coldness of the ink seep into his fingertip. He looked up, catching Julian's eyes. The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. This was not a myth of their ancestors. The foundation of their world was tied to their bloodlines, and it was currently waking up. Julian's hand hovered over the map, his fingers trembling slightly. The silence in the archive was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of a secret that demanded to be acknowledged. The air in the archive vibrated, a low-frequency hum that rattled the teeth. Alistair pulled his hand back, but the heat from the map lingered on his skin. Julian did not look away. The distance between them had vanished, replaced by a suffocating proximity that made every breath a conscious effort. A fine layer of dust drifted down from the ceiling, illuminated by the flickering charm, coating their shoulders in gray. Neither moved to brush it off. The floor beneath them gave a sudden sharp shudder, as if the manor itself were inhaling. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that synced perfectly with the frantic beat of Alistair's heart. Julian's gaze dropped to the journal, then snapped back to Alistair's face. His pupils dilated, until the blue of his irises was a thin, fragile ring. There was no room left for insults or posturing. The truth was etched in the way Julian's jaw locked, in the way his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. They were standing on a powder keg of ancient, sentient magic, and the fuse was burning. A spark passed between them, not of magic, but of cold, hard comprehension. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the terrifying weight of their shared burden. Alistair reached out and slammed the heavy cover of the journal shut. The sound echoed through the stacks like a gunshot. Julian did not flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his shoulder brushing against Alistair's as he reached for the spine of the book to steady it. The contact was brief, but it held the static charge of their combined magic. They stood there for a heartbeat, two enemies bound by the same terrifying truth. Alistair tucked the journal under his arm, his grip tight enough to turn his knuckles white. He looked at the archway, then back at Julian. There was no need for spoken agreements. The air around them had shifted, the previous hostility replaced by a cold, pragmatic focus. Julian nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that signaled his departure from the old order. They turned in unison, moving toward the exit with a synchronized pace. As they passed the rows of shelves, the floor groaned, a deep, metallic protest that vibrated through their boots. Alistair did not look back. Julian followed, his presence a steady, dark shadow at his side. They left the archives behind, stepping into the wider, colder halls of the Academy. The heavy oak doors of the archive groaned shut behind them, sealing the secrets within. Outside, the main corridor of Blackwood felt different. The stone walls seemed to lean in, the shadows stretching and contracting with a rhythmic, pulsing life that had not been there before. Alistair stopped, his hand resting on the cold masonry of a pillar. The stone was warm, vibrating with the same low-frequency hum that had defined the journal. Julian stood a few paces away, his gaze fixed on the vaulted ceiling where the architecture seemed to be realigning itself. The Academy was waking up, and it was reacting to the two of them. They were no longer just students or rivals. They were the catalysts for the shift. Alistair looked at Julian, seeing the same grim realization reflected in the other man's eyes. The history they had been taught, the lines drawn between their families, the petty animosities, all of it had been rendered obsolete by the truth beneath the floorboards. They stood in the center of the grand hall. The moonlight poured through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes swirling around them like a storm. The foundations of their world were no longer static. They were fluid, waiting to be reshaped by the power they now held between them. Alistair tightened his grip on the journal as Julian stepped forward. If you're enjoying the story of Blackwood Academy, please like, follow, and share. Leave your comments to help us improve our stories.